Chapter 5, The Problems of Empire, from 1763 to 1776. Let's get started. An empire transformed. First, let's look at the costs of this empire. Britain's national debt soared as a result of the Great War for Empire, and to pay it off, higher import duties were imposed at home, and excise levies, a kind of a sales tax, were increased. The increases were passed on to British consumers. To collect taxes, the size of the British bureaucracy, that's government workers and officials, was doubled and its powers increased. Smugglers were arrested and cargo was seized. The price of empire had turned out to be debt and a more intrusive government. To reverse the growth of government power, British opposition parties, the Country Party and the Radical Whigs, demanded that Parliament be made more representative of the property-owning classes. The war also exposed the weak authority of British royal governors and officials. To assert its authority, Parliament passed a Revenue Act in 1762 that curbed corruption in the customs service, and the Royal Navy was instructed to seize vessels that were carrying goods between the mainland colonies and the French islands. The British victory over the French resulted in a shift in imperial military policy. In 1763, the ministry deployed a peacetime army in North America, indicating its willingness to use force to preserve its authority over all the inhabitants of the colonies. Ministers believed that the colonists who gained most of the benefits from the war should also pay their fair share of the expenses accrued during the conflict. Many in Britain didn't see these new taxes on colonists as unreasonable. They gained from the cost of the war. And if you really look at it, they had a case to make. So George Grenville and the Reform Impulse. First, let's look at the Sugar Act. But before that, we got to look at what they did to currency. Reform-minded Prime Minister George Grenville won approval of the Currency Act of 1764 that banned the use of paper money as legal tender, thereby protecting the British merchants from colonial currency that was not worth its face value. Grenville then proposed the Sugar Act of 1764, which was basically a new navigation act, to replace the widely evaded Molasses Act of 1733. Americans, arguing that the Sugar Act would wipe out rum distilleries, vowed to disobey the law. The end of salutary neglect. Americans also argued that the Sugar Act was contrary to their Constitution, since it established a tax and all taxes ought to originate with the people, according to the British law. The Sugar Act closed a Navigation Act loophole by extending the jurisdiction of Vice Admiralty courts to all customs offenses, many of which had previously been tried before local common law courts. So now if you get charged in the colonies, you don't see a court of your peers, okay? They're all appointed by the crown. So that was seen as unfair, and then that would bring an overall expected outcome. After living under a policy of salutary neglect, Americans believed that the new British policies were discriminatory and deprived them of their basic rights as British citizens. British officials insisted on the supremacy of parliamentary laws and denied that colonists were entitled to even the traditional legal rights of Englishmen, such as the right of no taxation without representation. The Americans, as colonists, were second-class subjects of the king. An open challenge to the Stamp Act of 1765. Taxation sparked the first great imperial crisis. Grenville followed the Sugar Act of 1764 with a proposal for a Stamp Act in 1765. The Stamp Act would require small printed markings on all court documents, land titles, and various other documents, and served as revenue to keep British troops in America. Benjamin Franklin proposed American representation in Parliament, but British officials rejected the idea, arguing that Americans received virtual representation in Parliament. Grenville introduced the Stamp Act in Parliament with the goals being to not only raise revenue, but to also assert the right of Parliament to lay an internal tax on the colonies. Parliament also passed, at the request of General Thomas Gage, the Quartering Act of 1765, directing colonial governments to provide barracks and food for the British troops stationed in the colonies. Parliament also approved Grenville's proposal that violations of the Stamp Act be tried in vice admiralty courts. Using the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy, Grenville's attempt to fashion an imperial system in America provoked a constitutional confrontation with the colonies on taxation, jury trials, military quartering, and the general question of representative self-government. So you can see that there's a crash course happening here. There's gonna be a big clash here, where the colonies believe that what they're setting up against them is unfair, where they have these vice admiralty courts of British loyalists, or British folks, whereas the British officials are looking at the former courts and they're like, well, they're all colonists, and they kind of let people go and look the other way. The British Crown or British Empire is looking for revenue and the ability to raise it in the colonies, something they have not been able to do. The dynamics of rebellion from 1765 through 1770. Formal protests and the politics of the crowd, or what you could also say is the mob. The Stamp Act Congress. First, what are patriots? They're defenders of American rights. Organized protest, rioted, and articulated an ideology of resistance. Several colonial assemblies issued formal protests condemning the Stamp Act as a violation of American freedoms. 9 colonies sent delegates to the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 and issued a set of resolves challenging the constitutionality of the Stamp Act and Sugar Acts, declaring that only the colonists' elected representatives could tax them, and speaking against the loss of American rights and liberties, especially trial by jury. Most delegates were moderate men who sought compromise, not confrontation. They humbly petitioned for repeal of the Stamp Act. Several also called for a boycott of British goods. So let's look at some crowd actions. Angry colonial mobs led by men who called themselves the Sons of Liberty demanded the resignation of tax collectors and destroyed the property of supporters of imperial authority. Shopkeepers, artisans, laborers, and seamen intimidated royal officials throughout the colonies. So what were the motives of the crowd? Rioters had many reasons for protesting. Resentment towards military officers, religious passions that ignited dislike of the arrogance and corruption of royal bureaucrats, and simply the excitement of it. Popular resistance throughout the colonies nullified the Stamp Act. This success confirmed the patriot ideology that political authority rose through the people. So let's look at the ideological roots of this resistance. Although initial American protests focused on particular economic and political matters, patriot lawyers and publicists also provided the resistance movement with an intellectual rationale, a political agenda, and a visible cadre of leaders. Patriot publicists drew on 3 intellectual traditions: English common law, the rational thought of the Enlightenment, and an ideological agenda based on the Republican and Whig strands of the English political tradition. Writings espousing these traditions turned a series of riots and tax protests into a coherent political movement. So English common law argued that as subjects to the British monarchies, colonists deserved these certain rights. And you know the Enlightenment, the whole idea of natural rights that came from Locke and separation of powers. And these Whigs in Parliament were favorable to the colonists. There were quite a few of them, but not enough to stop the legislation from passing of these different taxes. Another kind of freedom. The patriot rhetoric of colonists becoming the slaves of Parliament through taxation without representation inspired the first expressions of opposition to slavery as a violation of human rights and motivated slaves in northern colonies to file petitions to end slavery. Interesting. Southern slaveholders, fearful of ending slavery for economic reasons, suppressed language referring to the natural rights for human beings. African Americans did not gain rights or true liberty during the struggle for colonial independence. Only a few colonists would challenge slavery. Some examples were Ben Franklin and James Otis. Franklin at a very young age owned slaves, but after that he was a critic of slavery, but delicately. So Parliament and the Patriots square off again. Charles Townshend will step in. In Parliament, the new Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham, mollified colonists by repealing the Stamp Act and modifying the Sugar Act. But he pacified hardliners with the Declaratory Act of 1776, which reaffirmed Parliament's authority to make laws binding American colonists. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, strongly favored restrictions on colonial assemblies and promised to find a new source of English tax revenue in America. To secure revenue for the salaries of imperial officials in the colonies, the Townshend Act of 1767 imposed duties on paper, paint, glass, and tea imported to America. The Revenue Act of 1767 created a Board of Customs, Commissioners in Boston, and Vice Admiralty Courts in Halifax, Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. By using parliamentary imposed tax revenues to finance administrative and judicial innovations, Townshend directly threatened the autonomy and authority of American political institutions. To limit colonial constitutional debate over internal taxation, Townshend levied duties only on trade, a type of tax colonists had traditionally not opposed. So, guys, the British are looking for different ways to tax the colonies without getting such a huge rebellion to it. They're trying everything they can. A second boycott and the Daughters of Liberty. Townshend's measures turned American resistance into an organized boycott of British goods. Colonial women, traditionally concerned with the community's well-being, organized into groups such as the Daughters of Liberty, and supported the non-importation movement by expanding domestic production through the increase in homespun cloth. Such activism brought women into the public sphere. The boycott also mobilized colonial assemblies into political action. Surveillance, coercion, and harassment of merchants and customers who resisted the movement contributed to divisions within colonial society. Now there's going to be troops in Boston. American resistance only increased British determination. In 1765, American resistance to taxation had provoked a parliamentary debate. In 1768, it produced a plan for military coercion and resulted in the sending of 2,000 British troops to Boston. So now the problems of the West. The British government officials also debated the issue of land in the West acquired through the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the proclamation line that divided colonists from Indians, and the three new colonies of Quebec, East Florida, and West Florida. Gentlemen speculators desiring investments, officers paid for their services during the 7 Years' War and land warrants, Indian traders wishing to sell land grants they received from Ohio Indians, and countless squatters contributed to a sizable migration into the Ohio River Valley. Ohio Indians hoped to stem this movement by organizing the Sciotos Confederacy. Colonial Secretary Hillsborough intended to turn the proclamation line from a temporary into a permanent demarcation. Colonial migrants, confused and frustrated by this policy change, vowed to protect their property rights. Parliament will start the waiver, though. Prime Minister Lord North convinced Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts, but the tax on tea remained. The Boston Massacre. British soldiers in Boston worked jobs that colonists wanted. The American trade boycott began to have a major impact on the British economy. The rising trade deficit with the Americans convinced some British merchants to petition Parliament that the Townshend duties were a mistake. Early in 1770, Lord North persuaded Parliament to accept a compromise plan that repealed the duties on manufactured items but retained the tax on tea as a symbol of Parliament's supremacy. The Boston Massacre, the killing of 5 Bostonians by British soldiers on March 5, 1770, created much resentment towards the Crown and Parliament. Sovereignty will continue to be debated. By 1770, the most outspoken patriots had repudiated parliamentary supremacy, claiming equality for the American assemblies within the empire. Royal governors such as Thomas Hutchinson insisted that Parliament had supreme power. Some Americans were prepared to resist by force if Parliament or the King insisted on exercising Britain's claim to sovereign power. The road to independence. A compromise repudiated. The East India Company and the Tea Act. Samuel Adams established a committee of correspondence and formed a communication network between Massachusetts towns that stressed colonial rights. The burning of the customs vessel Gaspee roused other states such as Virginia, Connecticut, South Carolina, and New Hampshire to set up their own committees of correspondence that would communicate with other colonies. That customs vessel Gaspee was burned in the Narragansett Bay off the shores of Cranston, Rhode Island. If you ever heard of Gaspee Days in that part of Cranston, near the Providence line, that is where the Gaspee was burned. The committees sprang into action after the passage of the Tea Act, which relieved the British East India Company of paying duties on tea it imported to Britain or exported to the colonies. The Tea Act made the East India Company's tea less expensive than Dutch tea, which Americans had smuggled into the colonies. Radical patriots accused the ministry of bribing Americans to give up their principled opposition to British taxation. The Tea Party and the Coercive Acts. The Patriots effectively nullified the Tea Act, forcing the East India Company's ships to return tea to Britain or to store it in public warehouses. In response to Massachusetts Governor Hutchinson's assistance to land a shipment of tea and collect the tax, a group of patriots threw the tea into Boston Harbor. In 1774, Parliament reacted to this defiance by enacting 4 coercive acts to force Massachusetts into submission. The 4 coercive acts included the Boston Port Bill that closed Boston Harbor to shipping, the Massachusetts Government Act that annulled the colony's charter and prohibited most town meetings, a new quartering act that mandated new barracks for British troops, and a Justice Act that allowed trials for capital crimes to be transferred to other colonies or to Britain. Patriot leaders branded these measures intolerable. The activities of the committees of correspondence created a sense of unity among patriots. Many colonial leaders saw the Quebec Act of 1774 as another demonstration of Parliament's power to intervene in American domestic affairs, since it extended Quebec into territory claimed by American colonies and recognized Roman Catholicism. Well, the Continental Congress would respond. Delegates from 12 colonies created the Continental Congress, a new colonial assembly, and met in Philadelphia in September of 1774 to address a set of controversial and divisive issues. Pennsylvanian Joseph Galloway proposed that America should have a president general appointed by the king and a national legislative council selected by the colonial assemblies. The plan was rejected by a single vote and was seen by a bare majority as being too conciliatory. Instead, the First Continental Congress demanded the repeal of the Coercive Acts and repudiated the Declaratory Act, stipulating that British control be limited to matters of trade. The Congress initiated a program of economic retaliation, beginning with a non-importation agreement that went into effect in December of 1774. The British ministry branded the Continental Congress an illegal assembly and refused to send commissioners to America to negotiate. The ministry declared that Americans had to pay for their own defense, and administration acknowledged Parliament's authority to tax them. It also imposed a naval blockade on American trade with foreign nations and ordered General Gage to suppress dissent in Massachusetts. The road to independence. The Continental Association. Ultimately, the success of the urban-led patriot movement will depend on the actions of the large rural population. At first, most farmers had little interest in imperial issues. But the French and Indian War, which had taken their sons for military duty, and pre- and post-war taxes changed their attitudes. The urban-led boycotts of 1765 and 1769 had also raised the political consciousness of many rural Americans throughout the establishment of the Continental Association and its rural committees. Patriots also appealed to the yeoman tradition of agricultural independence, as many northern yeomen felt personally threatened by British imperial policy. Southern planters feared dependency. Despite their higher standard of living, Southern slave owners had fears similar to those of the yeomen. As believers in English liberties and owners of slaves, they feared that their debts to British merchants would lead to political subjugation. Southerners also realized that Parliament could use the Coercive Acts to end representative assemblies and seize private property. Loyalists and neutrals. Many prominent Americans worried that resistance to Britain would destroy respect for all political institutions, ending in mob rule. Other social groups, such as tenant farmers and the regulators, refused to support the resistance movement, arguing that wealthy patriots intended to advance their own special interests. Many colonists, such as the Quakers and the Germans, opposed any violence based on religious conviction. Others attempted to stay neutral to protect property and livelihood. Although an estimated 15 to 20% of white Americans remained loyal to the Crown, Americans who favored resistance to British rule commanded the allegiance, or at least the acquiescence, of the majority of white Americans. Let's look at Lord Dunmore's war for a second. Nobody really knows much about this. General Gage's abandonment of Fort Pitt in October 1772 left settlers exposed and vulnerable to Indian attacks. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, used this opportunity to defy the crown and empower himself by organizing and training a militia. In 1775, Dunmore led this militia into successful battle against the Ohio Shawnees and Point Pleasant and claimed Kentucky. Settlers in the backcountry supported this action, arguing that they were independent because the crown had abandoned them. Sound familiar? Kind of sounds like a new version of Bacon's Rebellion 100 years later. Now let's get back to our friends in Massachusetts. When the Continental Congress met in 1774, New England was already in open defiance of British authority. In September, General Gage ordered British troops to seize Patriot armories and storehouses at Charleston and Cambridge. In response, 20,000 colonial militiamen mobilized to safeguard supply depots, the most famous regiment being the Minutemen of Concord. On April 18, 1775, Gage dispatched 700 soldiers to capture colonial leaders and supplies at Concord. Forewarned by Paul Revere and others, the local militiamen met the British first at Lexington and then at Concord. As the British retreated, militiamen ambushed them from neighboring towns, with both sides suffering losses. 12 years of economic conflict and constitutional debate ended in civil war. And if you look at the map there, the routes of the British expedition and the Patriot messengers on April 18, 1775. The Second Continental Congress organizes for war. Congress versus King George. In May 1775, Patriots met in the Second Continental Congress to address the events at Lexington and Concord. After losing battles at Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, Congress created a Continental Army headed by General George Washington. Moderates led by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania passed a petition that expressed loyalty to the king and requested the repeal of oppressive parliamentary legislation. Zealous patriots such as John Adams and Patrick Henry won passage of the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. The king refused the moderates' petition and issued a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition in August of 1775. Hoping to add a 14th colony to the rebellion, the Patriot forces invaded Canada and easily took Montreal in September, but in December 1775, they failed to capture Quebec City and withdrew. American merchants cut off all exports to Britain and its West Indian sugar islands, and Parliament retaliated with a prohibitory act, banning all trade with the rebellious colonies. Now let's look at some fighting in the South. Lord Dunmore of Virginia organized two military forces, one white, one black, and offered freedom to slaves and indentured servants who joined the Loyalist cause. Faced with black unrest and pressed by yeomen and tenant farmers demanding independence, Patriot planters called for a break with Britain. By April 1776, radical patriots had, through military conflict, transformed the North Carolina Assembly into an independent provincial Congress, which instructed its representatives to support independence. By May 1776, Virginia patriots had followed suit. Occupying Kentucky. After Dunmore's War in 1775, independent parties of settlers such as Daniel Boone moved into Kentucky and established fort-like settlements to protect their communities from the Ohio Indians. In 1776, Virginia fulfilled the migrants' request to be annexed by creating 6 frontier counties and supplying them with munitions. The Continental Congress supported this decision and dispatched troops and arms to the area. Thomas Paine's common sense. Many colonists believed that opportunity for negotiations with Parliament still existed. John Dickinson convinced Congress in July 1775 to send King George III the olive branch petition, which pleaded with the king to negotiate. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a call for independence and republicanism. Common Sense aroused the general public and quickly turned thousands of Americans against British rule. Paine's message was not only popular but also clear. Reject the arbitrary and tyrannical powers of the king and parliament and create independent republican states. If you look at the quote, a government of our own is our own natural right. 'Tis time to part. So independence will be declared. On July 4th, 1776, the Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, the main author of the Declaration, justified the revolt by blaming its rupture on King George III rather than on Parliament. Jefferson proclaimed that all men were created equal, they possessed the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. By linking these doctrines of individual liberty, popular sovereignty, and republican government with independence, Jefferson established them as defining values of the new nation. Colonists celebrated the Declaration of Independence by burning King George III in effigy and topping statues of the king. These acts helped to break the ties to the monarch and establish the legitimacy of republican state governments. So a quick recap: the end of the French and Indian War equals debt, which equals increased taxes, and the end of salutary neglect. The Stamp Act brings about the Stamp Act Congress, where the Stamp Act is overturned and the colonists' resolve increases. Also know the smuggling and boycotting still continues. The print revolution. The committees of correspondence helped spread ideas, pamphlets, newspapers, committees of correspondence to the different town meetings. The Tea Act, the Tea Party, that yields to the British response to the Coercive or Intolerable Acts, and then in response to that, the First Continental Congress. Most colonists in the first half of the 1770s did not want independence. They longed for the return of salutary neglect. And Common Sense by Thomas Paine appeals to many colonists and helps bring independence over the hump. That is it for Chapter 5. Until next time, thanks for watching.